very good. Thank you. What a wonderful conference. My thanks both to Roderick and to Daniel and to the John Templeton Foundation and the IAP for bringing together such a remarkable group of people. A conference is only as good as the people that you have in attendance, and this group is brilliant. I haven't had a boring conversation yet, except perhaps from my side, but you're a wonderful group of people. We've had conversations in the meals, we've had conversations after the meals. We were up until nearly midnight in this room, sitting around talking about these issues. Just a wonderful group of people, and that is what makes a conference like this worthwhile. So brilliantly done, guys. You really knocked it out of the ballpark, picking these people to come. I promised a talk on formal epistemology and the formal epistemology of testimony regarding miracles. Unfortunately, formal epistemology means logic or math, and so there is some of that today. If you have the handout in your packet, I've attempted to mitigate the inevitable anguish this will cause some of you by putting little boxes where I say what the math means. So if you're willing to hum the equations, you can see what they mean by looking in that little box, and I'll also try to do that as I go along. But warning to those of you who have severe allergic reactions to mathematics, there is some in this talk, so just be prepared. I like to start talks of this type with an epigraph, and here I chose one from the eminent French experimental physicist Arago. Doubt, he says, is a proof of modesty. It has seldom harmed the progress of the sciences. I could not say as much for incredulity. Apart from pure mathematics, whoever pronounces the word impossible is wanting in prudence. By the time that we're done, I hope you see why I chose that as an epigraph for this talk. We'll begin with the Prince of Skeptics, David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, who famously in 1748 published his philosophical essays, since retitled An Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. And in the 10th of those essays of miracles, he writes, I flatter myself that I have discovered an argument which, if just, will with the wise and learned be an everlasting check to all kinds of superstitious delusion, and consequently will be useful as long as the world endures. So the first, modesty was not among David's faults. But the first part of this talk, I'd like to examine his argument in favor of an everlasting check, because that's a very bold claim. Here's the ground of Hume's objection in his own words. In part one of his essay, he says, a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. And as a firm and unalterable experience has established these laws, the proof against a miracle from the very nature of the fact is as entire as any argument from experience can possibly be imagined. Now, if that is the case, then if you have some argument in favor of a miracle claim, it is opposed by an argument that cannot be overcome. So it's always going to be an unequal contest between the argument against and any weaker evidence that you have for. And that's the ground of his objection in part one. I realize there are people who contest this reading of Hume, Vogelin in particular, but I think answered Vogelin in my review of his book in mind. It's a very bold objection. Notice how strong the language is in which he follows this up. Upon the whole, then, it appears that no testimony for any kind of miracle can ever possibly amount to a probability, much less to a proof. And that even supposing it amounted to a proof, 'twould be opposed by another proof derived from the very nature of the fact which it would endeavor to establish. Can ever possibly, my word, right? These are modal terms. These are very, very strong terms. In I believe the 5th edition and subsequent editions of the essays, he moderated that claim, rephrasing it and saying, has ever amounted, rather than can ever possibly amount. So his initial claim was very bold. I think perhaps in response to certain criticisms from George Campbell and William Adams, he pulled back a bit. But in other places in the essay, he's still making these strong claims. Notice the worst case scenario would be a miracle in a new system of religion, specifically a religious miracle. Oh, now that's just totally impossible, right? Should this miracle be ascribed to any new system of religion? Men in all ages have been so much imposed on by ridiculous stories of this kind that this very circumstance would be a full proof of a cheat, and sufficient with all men of sense, not only to make them reject the fact, but even reject it without farther examination. So the path of inquiry is closed. If you're rational, if you're wise and learned, you should reject the miracle claim, not merely reject it in the end, but reject it without even bothering to look into anything further. Oh, a religious miracle. Well, we know all about those, and then the case is closed. I sometimes think, for those of you who have read Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, that there's a sort of phenomenon at work akin to the voice of Saruman here. He makes others want to seem wise and reasonable by swift agreement with what he says. Because I am going to be talking about a critique of Hume, I need to give a different conception of law and miracle from the one that he is working with. And I don't mean to then trade on equivocation, but when I was talking to Paul earlier, he said, hey, you should just go ahead and put this up front. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. As I see it, and this is a definition that I have in common with J.L. Mackie, an atheist, laws of nature tell us how nature behaves when it is left to itself. If the physical system is closed and isolated, the laws of nature tell us how it behaves. That is their job. They are not universal generalizations that are to hold whether the system is interfered with from the outside or not. They tell us how it behaves when it is not. A miracle is an event that would not have occurred when nature is left to itself. I'm phrasing this rather carefully because I was mindful of some points that Barbara raised in her talk, and I'm not here claiming that the physical laws that we have give us a closed system. This is compatible with that, but is a weaker statement here. I'm simply saying there's a way that things would have occurred had nature been left to itself, and a miracle is not among those things. So it's not a violation of the laws of nature, but a deviation from how nature would behave if left to itself. Finally, a religious miracle, and it is important to say this because what Hume said, is one that functions as a sign, and that is a clearly detectable deviation produced by the action of a supernatural agent, hence a religious miracle, that certifies a message or an individual as having supernatural authority. But the important word here is the word sign, because that's what makes it significant within the religious context. William Adams was a contemporary of Hume and wrote a rejoinder to Hume within Hume's lifetime. Hume read it, said simply, I think he treated me better than I deserve, and Hume didn't make any public reply. Adams was the Latin tutor for Samuel Johnson. So there's a fun connection there. An experienced uniformity, he writes, in the course of nature hath been always thought necessary to the belief and use of miracles. These are indeed relative ideas. There must be an ordinary, regular course of nature before there can be anything extraordinary. A river must flow before its stream can be interrupted. So Adams is working with his conception of an ordinary course of nature and a miracle as a deviation from that ordinary course. Now, this is the point at which things get a little bit more technical. So let me just lay this out as an argument without any symbols first. In religious contexts, miracles are supposed to function as signs. Miracles that function as signs would be impossible unless they took place against the backdrop of a stable natural order, since that is what enables them to function as signs. Therefore, the existence of a stable order of nature cannot be used as an argument against miracles in religious contexts. Now let's see if we can put a cutting edge on that. To do this, I'm going to use a little bit of probability theory. This is the point at which some of you need to close your eyes. If, on the supposition that M, a particular miracle claim, were true, it would be inevitable that U, the uniform backdrop so far, also be true, then U cannot be evidence against M. Why not? Because if the probability of U given M is 1, then the probability of M given U, the probability of the miracle, supposing it to be the case that there is a uniformity, is greater than or equal to just the probability of a miracle absent that consideration. If the probability of U given M is approximately equal to 1, then at worst, the probability of a miracle given the uniformity will be approximately the same as it was before. There's no strong probabilistic disconfirmation for the particular miracle claim given the uniformity of nature. That just doesn't work that way. And this all follows from the axioms of elementary probability. This is not some esoteric or special religious application. This is just straight up math. So what that means for those of you who are just now opening your eyes is the fact that in our ordinary experience, dead men stay dead cannot be a significant piece of evidence against a resurrection considered as a miraculous sign. It will not do the work Hume wants it to do in the very sort of case, the religious context, where he is most implacably skeptical. Some of you are still waking up. Let's try this with pictures. This is a sign, and it has a message that I very much want you to take away from this talk. Unfortunately, the font and the background are the same color, so you can't tell what the sign is, right? So this is not helpful. This is not doing what it needs to do for me. It's communicating nothing. If only I had thought ahead, I would have made the font in a different color from the background, and then you could see the message that I so desperately want you to take away from this talk. So the background and the message, the sign, must stand out against one another in order for you to be able to tell. And that is really just a visual representation of the point that the math is making here and that William Adams made back while Hume was still alive in his essay in answer to Hume's essay. Now you may be thinking, surely rare events require more evidence to establish them than ordinary events do. I mean, you can't really be saying, can you, that, hey, if it's a miracle, you should just believe them all. Certainly not. That is not the claim. Let me go back to someone who was writing when Hume was a teenager, the Bishop of London, Thomas Sherlock. In his Trial of the Witnesses of the Resurrection, the 4th edition, 1729, Hume, of course, was born in 1711, so he was 17 or 18 years old when the Trial of the Witnesses came out. Sherlock says, I do allow that this case and others of like nature require more evidence to give them credit than ordinary cases do. You may therefore require more evidence in these than in other cases. But it is absurd to say that such cases admit no evidence when the things in question are quite manifestly objects of sense. A dead man is something you can apprehend with your eyes, with your hands. So is a living one. The distinction between them, I dare say, all of you think you are competent to make. So yes, you may ask for more evidence in this case, but you may not say there is no evidence that could make it credible. That is blocking the path of inquiry. In 2000, a philosopher of science named John Earman published a book with the very provocative title, Hume's Abject Failure, the Argument Against Miracles. And what made the book so provocative is the fact that Earman is himself religiously agnostic. But he's wonderfully critical of Hume's argument. He says it's the kind of overreaching that gives philosophy a bad name. And he points out that back in the 19th century, the British mathematician and logician Charles Babbage wrote a book called The Ninth Bridgewater Treatise, in which he did a formal analysis of the value of testimony with a view to answering Hume. And Babbage got it basically right. So this is another point where things get a little technical. There's this wonderful proof where we say if you have n witnesses, then the conditional probabilities like that work together as the product of a bunch of other factors, and then we can factor this. Oh dear. Yes, moving on. Right. So here's what the math means. A sufficient number of independent testimonies, and that's probabilistically independent, that's an important point, each of which has at least a certain minimum amount of force, will overcome any finite presumption against a miracle. So unless you are entitled to say there's an infinite presumption against a miracle, and how could you be an empiricist and say that, then Hume's everlasting check fails. A cumulative case can, in principle, make any miracle claim credible. Aren't you glad that I had a sign up there that we could actually read? Okay. So that's what the math means. But, yeah, as you might expect, Hume's defenders did not take this critique lying down, and there have been several attempted responses. I think one of the cleverest is from Arif Ahmed at Cambridge. He's, in a recent article in Mind, attempted to rescue Hume by pointing out that the assumption of independence is often false. So consider the case of an audience watching a performance by a stage magician, and the stage magician manages to convince someone in the audience that he has sawn a woman in half. Well, what would we say? Did he really saw a woman in half? Odds are pretty low, right? But we think if he convinced someone, then he must have a fairly convincing act, right? The illusion must be fairly good. And if it's a fairly good illusion, it wouldn't be surprising if he convinced some other members of the audience as well. So the value of a second testimony, oh, he sawed a woman in half, is reduced, because we're already expecting that if it didn't happen, someone else will be fooled anyway. So the various testimonies are not independent, conditional on the assumption that the event didn't really take place. There's an explanation. You're all sitting in the same audience. You're looking in the same direction. He set things up very carefully so it looks a certain way from your point of view, and it'll probably look that way to you and to you and to you as well. In such cases, the probability that more and more people will be fooled by the illusion is greatly raised, and that means that the successive pieces of evidence dwindle in force towards zero, which violates the conditions of the Babbage, Holder, Earman argument. So here's the math. Fairly often, says Ahmed, and I think he is right about this, in cases of testimony, there's positive dependence among the pieces of evidence on the supposition that M did not take place. No magical work was done here, but there's positive dependence. And in at least some such cases, it's plausible that independence fails in such a way that a certain measure of the value of a given piece of evidence will dwindle not towards some value j, as on your handout, or toward the log of j, but towards zero. Logarithms. Why are we talking about logarithms? They're just exponents that help us turn multiplication into addition. A piece of evidence that has no weight is going to have a log of 0, and so that makes it a convenient reference point. It's just a little convenience. If it bothers you, we won't mention it again much. So here's what the math means. In certain cases, a critical assumption of the Babbage, Holder, Earman argument against Hume's everlasting check fails. But that's not quite the same thing as saying that the everlasting check works. It's just saying there's an argument that has a lacuna. And so allow me to critique the critique. Here's the problem with Ahmed's rescue. Even if independence fails in this fashion, it doesn't follow that the force of the evidence is always finite. So some of you may be familiar with the Harmonic Series, 1 plus 1/2 plus 1/3, and generally the terms in the denominator that goes up by 1. The Harmonic Series is a series the terms of which dwindle towards 0, but its sum is infinite. And if the logarithms of the ratios of the likelihood terms form some series that dominates some infinite portion of the harmonic series, then the force of that evidence will also be infinite, and something like the result of the Babbage-Earman argument will come back into play. So here's what the math means. Failure of the independence assumption won't rescue Hume's everlasting check. The cumulative testimonial evidence might have a theoretical, finite limit to its force, but it might not. Without further information about the specific case in question, we cannot say anything more. Everything depends on the details. And this is bad news for Hume, because Hume wants to stand above the fray. He wants to hurl down thunderbolts from on high and not get his hands dirty. There is no historical work on the question of the central Christian miracles in anything Hume wrote, whereas his contemporaries were writing on this extensively. Nathaniel Lardner, one of his contemporaries, wrote a book, Credibility of the Gospel History, in 17 volumes, meticulously examining every significant person, place, and event mentioned in the Gospels. Measured by that standard, Hume hasn't even begun to enter the argument. So if everything depends on the details, then there's not an everlasting check. There's not a simple, as we say, silver bullet. There's no way to drive a stake through the heart of this particular sort of claim. This is not to say that any particular miracle claim ever does have enough weight to make it credible. That is what must be established on the basis of evidence. So let's talk about evidence, because historical evidence is a wonderful thing. There's a richness of texture to historical evidence. I've argued that there is no everlasting check, but equally, there are never infinitely many witnesses, right? Why are we even talking about infinitely many witnesses? There are only finitely many people who can give testimony to any event whatsoever. So I suggest that our fixation on this particular problem may have deterred philosophers from examining the more interesting set of problems raised by the richness of real historical evidence. So what does real historical evidence look like? I'll focus on the case that Hume clearly has in mind, though he never comes out and speaks much about it. Let's look at the case of the resurrection. The witnesses are not all confined to one vantage point, as they were in the case of the stage magician. And what that means is that if they agree, it's much more difficult to find a single, simple explanation for how they could all have been fooled. It's easy if everyone's just out there in the audience and the magician's up here. You can't come around and view him from behind, right? But real historical evidence is very rarely situated that way. We often have a much richer, more complex body of data. Their testimonies are not bare assertions that the event in question happened. Witness number 1 says, yes, this happened. Witness number 2 says yes. Witness number 3 says yes. That's a toy case that's designed to make it simpler for us to do our analyses, but real evidence is often much more complex. The different testimonies may include details that interlock with details in other testimonies in ways that increase their credibility. I've spoken with some of you about the argument from undesigned coincidences. This is an argument that is used in secular history, but has wide application when it comes to the Gospels, the book of Acts, the letters of Paul, and that kind of internal interconnection is a feature of real evidence that we never discuss in the literature on Hume. My wife, Lydia McGrew, has a paper on the formal analysis of undesigned coincidences. I believe that's just out in the last year in Erkenntnis. A little bit more math, sorry. Focus on the likelihood ratio. Here's what that is. What's the probability of the conjunction of our bits of evidence, all n of them, however many we may have, supposing that m is true, divided by the probability of those bits of evidence, supposing that m is false? That ratio is a good way of measuring the net force of the evidence, and it's quite common in the philosophy of science literature to focus on the likelihood ratio. Both terms are probabilities. That is, the numerator can have any value between 0 and 1. The denominator can take values greater than 0, and it'll still be meaningful, but it can only go up to 1, so that the ratio of those two terms becomes important. Is it top-heavy? Is it bottom heavy, or is it just a wash? It's equal to 1. That's the crucial question. So that gives us our best measurement of the force of the evidence. The characteristics, this is the point I wish to argue for, of real historical evidence tend to reduce the denominator without significantly reducing the numerator. And what happens, of course, when the denominator is shrinking and the numerator is remaining relatively stable is that you get a larger and larger fraction, a more and more top-heavy fraction. So let's give an example from the gospel resurrection accounts. They are not at all cases of one person saying that Jesus rose from the dead and another person saying it and another person saying it. For example, women are reported to have been the first people at the tomb. This is unlikely to have been an invention, and in fact, Jesus' male disciples did not believe their word, as we're told in the Gospel of Luke, but we dismiss them as idle tales. Notice this quotation from Josephus: "Let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex." I'm sorry, ladies, you are just too funny and too bold. We can't take you seriously. But this was a common view in the first century. If you were inventing the story, why would you shoot yourself in the foot by putting witnesses at the tomb as the first witnesses who were likely to be dismissed, because we dismiss the testimony of women, again, from the Talmud, Rosh Hashanah. Any evidence which a woman gives is not valid to offer. Well, all right then. Why would you make that up? And now, if it really happened that way, then truth might constrain you. But if it didn't really happen that way, that would be a terrible way to invent your story. Second example, the differences in prima facie tensions in the four narratives provide strong evidence against collusion. So each of the gospel authors names a different set of women who came to the tomb. Each of them describes somewhat differently what they saw there. If you were trying to get together your propaganda narratives, you would want them all to line up a little bit more tidily than that. Now, a funny thing is Thomas Starkey, who's a legal authority, not writing on religious topics, says, and I have the quotation here if you want to see it later, that this is actually usually a good thing in testimony when there are various divergences. This is the common form of honest testimony. You very rarely have complete agreement on all of the details. In fact, when you do, you begin to think that the witnesses are colluding, that they have gotten together ahead of time and are putting this together as a sort of their talking points, as we say. So this fact reduces the probability of the conjunction of the evidence supposing not M, because collusion is one of the main ways of accounting for how testimonies might agree in a falsehood. So this reduces the number of ways for them to have gotten away with it falsely. The first witnesses proclaimed Jesus' resurrection in public, in the place where he had been crucified, in defiance of the secular and religious authorities, within 2 months of that crucifixion. These facts diminish the probability of the big conjunction of the evidence given not M, because it's much less risky to invent a false story about something alleged to have taken place long ago, or far away, or something that the authorities have no interest in contesting. Suppose that you wanted to start a new religion, and the new religion was going to be exclusive in the sense that you told practitioners of other religions that they were wrong. Where would you rather do it? Would you rather try to do that in München or in Mecca? My suggestion is you not try Mecca. You'll be dead before you hit baggage claim, right? You don't want it to be someplace where the authorities are implacably opposed, right? Here people might dismiss you as a crackpot. When the ruling authorities, who have the power of life and death, are implacably opposed to you, it's a much riskier proposition. But that's what they did. Not a promising way to start a false religion. How about trying to explain away the evidence? Well, the trouble is no single non-miraculous hypothesis explains so many diverse pieces of evidence so well as the supposition that it did in fact take place. So there's no significant convergence or unification because the diverse pieces of evidence aren't unified. They're not dependent on one another given not M. There's the math of it, but I'll skip past that lest more people fall asleep. So what the math means is a rich and varied body of evidence, the force of the individual pieces of evidence isn't significantly reduced in a cumulative case, because the mere denial of the miracle claim does not unify the different pieces of evidence. So let's try, though, right? Here's one. This will be what we call a gerrymandered skeptical hypothesis. No miracle took place, and Jesus merely swooned on the cross, and he survived infection and blood loss and dehydration in the days to come, and he emerged from his tomb, and his followers encountered him before anyone less favorably disposed did, and this limping, bleeding, half-dead Jesus managed to convince them that this was the best God Almighty could do by way of a resurrection to vindicate his message. And you see, tacking together a bunch of things with "and" makes this increasingly implausible. Even the great skeptic David Friedrich Strauss heaped scorn on the idea that this was what happened. Yes, it's a naturalistic option, but let's be serious. No, right? It's just not a good hypothesis. So the problem is that the auxiliary hypotheses are not probable given not M, and they're not significantly relevant to one another. So the formal part of this says you're basically doomed to multiplying together a lot of very small numbers. And when you multiply fractions that are much less than 1, your product is going to be much, much less than 1. It's going to dwindle very quickly. This is the proper application of the principle of dwindling probabilities. So one can gerrymander a hypothesis that will give high probability to each piece of a diverse body of evidence. We can do that. You can make one up. But what is gained in predictive power is lost in the sheer complexity of the resulting hypothesis, which becomes hideously improbable. Thomas Chalmers, one of my favorite authors, has this remark to make about written history, and I'll close here. He says, it's a peculiar subject, and the men who stand at a distance from it may multiply their suspicions and their skepticism at pleasure. But no intelligent man ever entered into the details without feeling the most familiar and satisfying conviction of that credit and confidence which it is in the power of historical evidence to bestow. Thank you.
You said that suppose that people like Reimarus, for example, thought the apostles tried to cheat.
Right.
Then they would have, that would be a very clumsy way to do so.
Right.
And I think you are right about that. But now suppose that God wanted to communicate with us via miraculous signs. I think this was what we see was a very clumsy, seems to be to me, also a very clumsy way to do so. Because he could have made himself much clearer. He could have made the evidence much more unambiguous than he did. And then if he did so, we wouldn't have to talk about it today.
Okay.
And so there are answers to this, I think, but what would be your answer? Why didn't he make himself clearer?
Right. So here's what I would say. There are, in any empirical investigation, no matter how much evidence we have, we can always say, well, we wish we had this other thing. We wish we had more. And that's an interesting observation, that doubtless true, but always the question is, do we have enough? Now, there's a curious comment that Pascal makes in his Pensées, where he says, there is enough light for those to follow who have an inclination to do so, and there is enough darkness for those who are otherwise inclined, right? So I guess I would say part of, and maybe I'm going back here to Joseph Butler's analogy of religion, part of some people's probation here on earth is the question of how well they will use the light that they are given, what use they will make, and that may be the case in intellectual endeavors as well as in other endeavors. I am persuaded by the public historical evidence that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead. I'm not normally the kind of guy who likes to just jump to statements like that. I have a certain natural incredulity, but I am persuaded by the evidence, and I am persuaded that when you enter into the details, which is exactly what Hume is encouraging you not to do, that you will also be confronted with a surprising body of evidence. I have not tried to present that body of evidence today. I don't expect to have persuaded anyone who was skeptically inclined merely by pointing out some formal considerations. My entire point is that formal considerations may shape our discussion, but they cannot answer it. But I do think that given what we know about human cognitive biases, we know that people are lamentably less inclined to follow the evidence wherever it leads than they might have been. And I think that this affords us an opportunity to exercise our intellectual faculties in a way that leads to satisfaction if we pursue it with all of the seriousness which the inquiry invites, which the significance of the issues invites.
I would like to come back to the definition of law. So your definition and Hume's definition. So your definition, I wonder if theists should accept this definition, because if you believe in providence, then nature left to itself would just disappear. So it strikes me as a kind of deistic definition of law or of miracle. And when you come back to Hume, I think, but I would like to hear you if you're right. If you really accept Hume's definition of laws of nature, then his argument still holds. Because if you accept that the law of nature is a universal regularity, then you have on one side the whole body of evidence for this universal regularity. And on the other hand, so you would have just one, so a limited amount of evidence for an exceptional, for a violation of this law. And so then you should never believe that the law of nature is violated, because you have more evidence to believe in this universal regularity.
Okay. So let me take the second point first. If you take the definition that a miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, in the strong sense in which you've just articulated it, I fear that Hume could be open to the challenge which some people like C.S. Lewis have leveled against him of simply begging the question, of simply assuming at the outset what the conclusion is to be. And again, Hume is an empiricist, right? Relations of ideas we can settle by pure reflection. Matters of fact require justification. Back to the first part of your question, I think the difficulty is if you say that it's a deistic conception because providence is everywhere, I think there's a distinction we need to make between two kinds of providence, general providence and special providence. And I think there's biblical warrant for this. So if you look at Nicodemus' words at the opening of John 3 when he comes to Jesus by night. He says, "Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher sent from God because no man can do these works that you do unless God is with him." Now Nicodemus is a Jewish leader. He believes in the general providence of God, but he also believes that sometimes God does specific things that he does not do at other times. This is not a deistic conception. It's a conception that makes a separation between general and special providence. And so I think that there's a biblical case for that, and I think that the distinction makes sense even more broadly philosophically, and that is what I would invoke at that point. You look as though you're not fully persuaded, which is fine, but we can continue that conversation later. That's fine.
So many forms of witness have been challenged through few forms, through the Gospels, 4 Gospels, but they report many witnesses. And we have no way to confirm all those individual pieces of testimony. So what does it reduce the value of those witnesses? That's my first question. Second question would be, what, like all those, or many of those witnesses, they had interactions, and perhaps they have influenced each other by talking to each other, sharing the same fears and so on. Doesn't that also reduce the value of those witnesses?
Okay, so 2 questions. The first question is about what we should do when we have reports that there were witnesses, but we don't have independent confirmation of those reports. We have what we have in the Gospels. Here I think it helps actually to roll up our sleeves and get our hands dirty and look at the internal interconnections within the Gospels as well as the external connections. I think when you do that, and this is what my talk tomorrow night will be about, you find that there's a very strong case, a surprisingly strong case to be made, that the authors of the Gospels, the evangelists, are close to the facts and habitually truthful. There are a number of places where the documents exhibit kinds of interconnections that are unlikely in fiction and in forgery. That is an indirect kind of evidence. It's not as direct as our having some other non-Christian source also say, oh yes, and Jesus rose from the dead, right? Then again, there's a special name for non-Christians who believe that Jesus rose from the dead, and that special name is Christians. That's what they became, right? So of course, that's something you can only expect from the Christian sources. But the internal texture of the evidence is very rich, and I'm sorry that I can't take the time standing up here to go into that, but perhaps we can talk afterwards and I'll give you some examples of that. Now, and then the second part of your question, just repeat that for me.
So many of the witnesses had contact with...
Right, so there's a lack of causal independence among them. However, lack of causal independence, causal interaction, does not necessarily radically diminish their probabilistic independence. And you'll remember just two things on that front. Number one, it can actually go the other way, right? Hey, I told them what I saw and I got thrown into jail and beaten and stoned and left for dead. What are you going to do? Right? Makes it less likely for the other guy to go out and do it. So we can actually, the failure of independence can go both ways. This is not just a one-way street. And given what we know about the opposition they faced, that's a very significant issue. But remember down here, see if I can just pull up the likelihood ratio here, wherever I had that. Yeah. So suppose, for the sake of the argument, that there is some diminishment as we have some of these pieces somewhat increase the probability of one another. Let's suppose independence fails and it fails in the direction of lessening the numerator. My contention would still be there's a strong case that it's going to lessen the denominator at least as sharply, maybe more sharply. And so I could even grant what you're saying regarding the numerator, and still the case might be strengthened, all things considered, as the denominator also shrinks. So why should we think that it makes any difference to use this definition when we intervene all the time? And the answer, very sort of broadly, is that I think we, with certain exceptions bracketed, we take it's being left to itself to it's not being interfered with things that are not embodied as we are embodied, that are not physical, that don't have mass, spin, charge, and so on. Now, the bracketed exception on that, I think, is related to the phenomena of consciousness, intentionality, and action. And of course, one of the other foci of this conference is the question, do things happen that would not otherwise have happened if agents engage in causal action, which agents are not wholly physical? And so that is itself an interesting question, an interesting part of it. Now, you had a second part, so I want to let you get to that.
There's just nature and its laws, the laws of nature. And now something happens that is contrary to the laws of nature in that possible world.
Right.
Violates the
okay, so it's something actually contrary to it. You have here, we're imagining for the sake of argument a system
Isn't that a miracle? Wouldn't that be a miracle?
Well, you've stipulated a boundary condition, right? The question seems a bit like asking what happens when an irresistible force meets an immovable body. Which of those conditions would you like to hold? Right? Are there immovable bodies or not? Because if there are irresistible forces, there aren't. So I would say that in such a circumstance, you're not going to have something happen in violation of the laws of nature. You're not going to have something that deviates from the course that they set down insofar as they set down a course. Now, the laws themselves might not be deterministic. They might not specify wholly the future outcomes. But in that case, you don't have something that is happening that varies from what they specify. You just have...
Something happens which violates the laws of nature.
Right, and my response is... That's an impossible world.
That this would be a miracle.
But it's also an impossible world, not a possible world.
No, it's a possible
world.
Of course it is.
That's the challenge. Okay.
Thank you. I think I agree with a lot of what you said in words about witnesses and evidence. I have some problems with these equations, not because I would not understand them, but because they assign probabilities. And I'm asking myself, what is the nature of these probabilities? They cannot be propensities, they cannot be frequencies,
Right.
they cannot be Bayesian probabilities, because you said nothing about the priors and the underlying tacit assumptions and their probabilities. So, I'm
So where are they
wondering-
coming from?
Yeah, and are they? I mean, I wouldn't trust the equations if I didn't trust the explanation in words.
Right.
I think the equations just illustrate what you said in words, but they don't prove it or
Right.
underlie it. How would you say it? Because all these equations are, they assume so many things that are not in there. What is the prior assumption of regularity? What is the prior probability of
Sure.
nature being almost regular or just to some degree,
Right.
and so on. So
Right. Well, you'll notice that as I've gone through here, I have very rarely assigned any specific numbers. So if you think there's a problem with assigning them, at least give me this much. I didn't try too hard to do the thing that you're most worried about, which is put a specific numerical value on it. But the short answer is these are epistemic probabilities, and we use epistemic probabilities in the philosophy of science in analyzing, and in general epistemology, in analyzing human rationality. Yes, there is a school of thought, particularly the frequentists, who say, no, you don't have any of these numbers if you don't have, asymptotically converging sequences in the long run and so forth. But as Keynes pointed out, in the long run, we are all dead. So the epistemic probabilities are not supposed to be themselves wholly bound down to a sort of a physical process like that. What's the joke about frequentists and Bayesians? Frequentists use rigorous mathematics to answer questions no one is asking, whereas Bayesians answer the questions everyone really wants answered by use of assumptions no one quite believes. I think that's the impasse that we're sometimes brought to. There is quite a literature on the subject. I have some sympathy for the attempt to ground some probabilities in frequencies, and I think we can do some of that. But I think underlying that and more fundamental are considerations of symmetry and simplicity. And those are the considerations, and Professor Swinburne is better credentialed than I to speak to that. But when we're talking about the assignment of prior probabilities, I think symmetries and simplicity are the main way that we generate sometimes definite probabilities, sometimes merely inequalities on the base. So we can say, for example, all else being equal, a simpler hypothesis should have a higher probability than a more complex one.
Tim, I don't have a question just so much as a comment, and I guess I invite you to say something about it if you have anything to say about it. It strikes me that the question regarding the clarity of the miraculous sign that we should expect is impacted when we suppose that God's purpose is to communicate in the first instance, not to each of us individually, at all times and places, but rather to communicate to all of us, or large and extended communities of us collectively, and that further, that it's part of his purposes that the community come to learn important truths only over time. And I think this is kind of implicit in the biblical narrative in the way it describes God's purposes, although it's often lost to us in modern culture because we're extremely individualistic.
Atomic, right.
So anyway, it's just an invitation. Do you have any thoughts on the kind of epistemological impact of thinking along those lines about God's purposes?
Right. Well, I certainly think that it is part of my duty as a Christian to be willing to help others who are in a less epistemically advantageous position. And if I get somebody writing to me from Saudi Arabia who says, I can't get a certain book, and you mentioned it in one of your YouTube lectures, mail a copy of the book to Saudi Arabia, right? We send these things, but the dissemination of information like that to people who are in restricted evidential circumstances is certainly something the community can do. I am afraid that I must confess that upon the whole, the Christian community today does not do a very good job where this is concerned. To the extent that when I announced as an undergraduate that I was going to go to a nearby university to study philosophy, people would accost me in the hallway and say, "You're going to study philosophy? You could get really messed up." And these were the Christians. That was the encouragement I received from their side. Say, "You may judge whether they were right, and I'm really messed up." But we certainly could do a much better job with that.
Tim, thank you for a very stimulating lecture. I lost my son and subsequently my wife later on. It was the resurrection of Christ and the evidence for it that grounds it for me, that helps me believe I will see him again. Can you help me distinguish between having faith, because it is the faith in the resurrection that gives me hope, but it's also the evidence that grounds it? The line between the two seems to be jumbled for many. Can you comment on the distinction between that?
Yeah. I have surprisingly little that I can say with regard to what you've gone through. But the word faith in the New Testament is our translation of the word pistis, and the fundamental meaning of that is hope. It does not mean hope in defiance of or in absence of evidence, but it means trust. Sorry, pistis is trust. It means trust, which of course may be well or poorly placed. If your trust is well placed, if your faith is well placed, does not make up the deficiencies of evidence. This is a response to the evidence. What you said reminded me of this quotation from one of the works, Lawrence Parsons. He dedicates his work on a study of the Gospels to the memory of my late dear son, the Honorable John Clare Parsons. I dedicate the following pages in humble recollection of his unblemished virtues and great acquirements, his filial piety, his gentle and polished manners, and his laudable ambition to render himself an ornament to his family and a benefactor to his country. He died on the 10th of August, 1828, when it was fondly hoped that he was just about to gather the fruit of his honorable labors during the long period of deep affliction for so great a loss. I studied the subject of this argument. There is nothing better to study. There is no better way to know that your trust is well placed.
Yeah, thank you very much. That fits well to what has been said before. Thank you very much for this very nice lecture. I really like this argument. But at the point where the hands get dirty, that's interesting. One of the interesting points. I wonder whether we can get a sort of closed set of things we want to talk about. I would never have come to the idea that I would ask, water turns into wine. What is the probability water turns into apple juice, water turns into Coke, or whatever there is or might be, yeah? So if we go through all these nitty-gritty details, yeah, would we ever come to a set of probabilities we think are relevant for the problem, or would we discuss about an enormous amount of things we have to think about? And when we plug numbers in, would we be able to get to numbers which are sort of agreeable, or would that go into a discussion of an enormous amount of details where we never can be sure or can agree on? And finally, we turn that all into the computer and get out that the probability of the resurrection is 95%. And someone would say, oh no, I'm more than, I think 15% is a better number. So has that been done? And has there been, has anybody gone through this process until a final number comes out? And what is the amount of credibility of this number? So this would be an exercise which would have to be done in one case, and then one could argue how reasonable.
So if you're asking me whether I have a recipe for bringing about Leibniz's dream, that when we disagree, we would merely sit down and say, let us calculate, the answer is, alas, I have not achieved that. I don't know how to bring about that eschatological state of affairs in which we all come rationally to the table and solve all these things once for all. I do think one can make progress with regard to these questions, and my wife and I have tried to do so in our article in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, where we actually go through a number of pieces of evidence, but even there, our scope is limited. So the way that I like to think about this, one can sort of break down, and I'll focus on the resurrection just for simplicity. One can break it down into sort of 4 quadrants. One can think of internal evidence in favor of the claim. One can think of external evidence in favor of the claim. One can think of internal difficulties or objections, and one can think of external difficulties or objections. So in that last category, you might say, yes, but doesn't Luke get the date of the census wrong in Luke 2? On the category over here, you might say, yes, but aren't there numerous contradictions among the narratives? So all 4 quadrants have rich things to be explored. I've debated Bart Ehrman, the biblical scholar, with regard to the question of the historical reliability of the texts. Unfortunately, he didn't much want to discuss that issue. He came prepared to discuss some other things instead. He wanted to turn it into a discussion of inspiration and inerrancy, whereas I wanted to talk about the historical reliability of the texts, the way we would talk about Tacitus or some other historian. So yeah, I am persuaded that we can make enough progress on it that the outlines become clear, and in some cases, even if 2 people sit down and one is more skeptical and therefore assigns less weight to certain pieces of evidence, the results are surprisingly similar, right? The difference between someone who thinks the probability is 0.99999 and somebody who thinks it's 0.97, that's not too great a difference, actually. And so I think you might be surprised how far one can get, even with rather skeptical assignments of probabilities. But you might want to have a look at our article in the Blackwell Companion for that.
Brilliant. Glad to finish it. All great. Thank you.
Thank you.